Hi there, and welcome to a brand new series that I like to call Branching Paths, where I want to take a look at a game series and decide whether or not it has taken a turn for the worse or has improved from where it started. In this show, I will only be looking at the main entries of the series I'll be talking about, no side games or any of that sort. So without further ado, let's introduce the game series which we will be looking into today and kicking off this brand new series with. This is the Branching Paths of Yoshi's Island. Yoshi's Island was a prequel/sequel to the popular game on the Super Nintendo, Super Mario World. Though nowadays everyone pretty much just calls it Yoshi's Island, seeing as this game is pretty much its own game from almost every aspect. Being released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo, Yoshi's Island was a latecomer to the system. But just because a game is late to the party doesn't mean it isn't good, seeing as many people, myself included, ranks this as one of the best games to ever come from Nintendo, and for some, one of the greatest games of all time. So why is it that this game gets all the praise that it does? Well, it's simply due to the fact that every core mechanic of this game is almost nearly perfected. Level design is welcoming to any new player with its simple layouts for the first world to teach and allow the player to learn and master the abilities which Yoshi uses to fight enemies and, of course, collect items. The game places items and things of that nature in ways in which the player has to figure out how to achieve the reward with an egg toss or by simple puzzle solving. And as each world is completed, the stages become a bit more challenging, making sure the player incorporates to some extent what he or she has been learning thus far. The gameplay itself even stands out to this day. It has similar traits to a typical Mario game, jumping from platform to platform and finding secrets in levels, though there are two additions which I feel make it stand out. The first being Yoshi's trademark egg toss. This is great on its own, but there's another additional gameplay element which I think helps perfect it, and that is auto running. It may not seem like much now, but this game would almost be a hassle to control if there was a button for specifically running. Look at it this way, anyone who has watched a speedrun of Yoshi's Island knows that there are many things that can be done due to the button layout and the freedom of having your hand available. While it may not seem that bad if you had to hold down a run button, it would make the game a bit more trickier to play when switching between jumping and shooting an egg and running around all at the same time. Having auto run available clears the way for having more accessible options on the controller, which is a great thing. And last but certainly not least, there is that which accompanies you throughout your whole journey, the music. Nearly every track in this game is close to perfection in most people's eyes. Koji Kondo really captured the essence of being on a tropical island with a bunch of dinosaurs and a baby. This music is happy and catchy to the simplest of terms, but not all is fun in games, considering that when the time comes, the music can get just as serious as the situations you'll be in. In fact, the final boss of this game not only is a great fight taking what you've learned throughout the entire game and using it on a different angle to throw the player off, but it's also home to quite possibly one of the best tracks to ever be in a video game. All of these elements form together to make an unforgettable experience of a game, which many people even to this day go back to and still have fun playing. With its success and big following, a sequel was sure to come, but was it the game we wanted? 11 years after its initial release, Yoshi's Island DS was released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS, and while critics gave it a pretty good score, fans were less than pleased. But before we get into that, let's look into the new additions which were brought into the sequel. The major thing, of course, is the addition of having baby versions of all the main Mario characters, and giving them each their own unique ability, which gives reasons to using each of the characters. However, with a positive, there are many negatives. One of the biggest negatives that I have with this entry is the design of the levels, so naturally the devs would want to utilize both screens to their potential, but this in the long run makes levels either way too long or too boring. Not to say that all the levels are like this, but this is the case for a majority of them. You remember the very long cave in the first Yoshi's Island? We'll take that level but put it throughout the entire game. This was the curse of the Nintendo DS, being new and having that unwritten rule of utilizing every everything the DS has to its fullest potential. And I feel there is another component that helps make these levels not as memorable or don't make them stand out as much as Yoshi's Island did, and that is the music. The music in Yoshi's Island DS is very lackluster when compared to the rest of the series. Take the underground theme for example. Listen to both samples to see what I mean. In the original game, the music usually reflected the scenario, but with the DS game, it just sounds like a bunch of noises happening at once. I know it's a different composer, but that kinda shows as well. And for me, it ties into why the levels aren't as memorable. See, with the music in the first game, the tracks, as I said, also reflect the scenarios that they're in, giving the player a sense of immersion with the levels. But with the DS soundtrack being weaker, it makes it not as memorable, and in turn, I also feel it makes the stages not as memorable. Even the final boss of the game isn't as much as spectacular as in the previous game. Much like the rest of the game, it tries to reflect the previous one, but it doesn't stand up to it. The last game had Big Bowser, let's do the same here, except the difference is the final boss in the first game challenged players by introducing them to a whole new playing field, and, as mentioned before, the final boss theme itself gave the perfect sense of adrenaline. The DS final boss is a very watered down version of said boss, music and all, and that perfectly sums up the game as a whole. It's just a watered down version of Yoshi's Island. With fans disappointed and no news of Yoshi games after, it seems like the series was dormant. That is until a new entry in the series was announced for the Nintendo 3DS. Yoshi's New Island was released for the Nintendo 3DS and would be the third installment of the Yoshi Island series. Many fans were happy to see their old pal coming back to a handheld console, which has treated Nintendo mascots pretty well up to that point. I never got a chance to play the game when it came out, but recently I had the chance to play it thanks to a good friend of mine lending me his copy. After finishing it, I had mixed opinions. I thought the game took a step in the right direction, but yet something just still doesn't feel right, mainly because it suffers some of the same issues that Yoshi's Island DS did. Levels are shorter, which is nice, and doesn't require dual screen mechanics, which is also very nice, but some of the levels are too short in my opinion, and they don't really offer much exploration like the first game did, or even the DS game. Heck, some of the levels I was just holding right and jumping a few times, and before I knew it, I had finished the level. Now granted, this is going through the levels without the thought of completion in mind. That could be said about all three games here, but even when I did, it wasn't too challenging, mainly because exploration wasn't a factor in finding most of the secrets. They were just a little bit out of the way. Also, I really don't like the idea of the medal system. I get the idea of it, it's just I don't like collecting all the flowers in a stage only to miss it on a roulette wheel. I didn't like that. But other than that, some of the levels weren't too bad. Some were decently paced and even quite enjoyable. But the factors that remain kind of put this game a little off my good list. One is difficulty. And by that, I mean there is none. Like I said, the levels aren't too bad, but the boss fights in this game, well, they're not as easy as in the DS game, but they're not any harder either. For one thing, the uniqueness of the midpoint bosses being a tiny little obstacle in your path have been replaced by Kamek because reasons, I guess. I don't know why they did it, to be honest. And the actual boss fights at the end of each world are just as laughable. It's kind of sad because while the bosses in the first game were simplistic in nature, they had some sort of way of providing a challenge. These just feel like an addition to the chore of a level rather than a reward for getting to the end of the world. And yes, that is how I view boss fights in these type of games. And the other factor in this game again is the music. Yeah, I know you must be sick of me complaining about this, but hey, I actually have some positives this time. The music I find isn't actually all too bad. It's nice and melodic, and it even has some pretty great tracks in it. I can tell that there was some thought and care put into the soundtrack. The only problem is it's not that memorable. Truth be told, after playing this game and talking to a few friends about it, I came to realize I couldn't remember a single track that came from this game. Again, it wasn't bad, but it didn't really stand out, which is a shame because there are some good tracks here. So as a whole, Yoshi's New Island did take a few steps in the right direction, but it failed to hit home in a few other areas, making it not a horrible entry in the very least, but it is a subpar entry at best. I know some people actually do like this game, and that could be said about the DS one, and please note, I do respect all opinions, but for me, this is how I view the current state of each game, and thus brings me to my conclusion. The Yoshi Island series has an odd history to say the least. It went from being one of the greatest games of all time to having a very forgettable sequel to getting a third installment which many were hesitant to try, and many don't bring up the conversation. It's not that hard to say that the Super Nintendo version is the one that's valued and respected most out of the series. And with all the odd changes that were brought into the sequels and subpar attempts to capture the spirit of its successor, people still tend to stick with the original. In terms of whether I think it has taken a turn for the worse or a complete opposite, I'll say this. The recent addition to the series did try to bring back the nostalgia of the original, and some parts of it almost succeeds. Sadly, it doesn't quite live up to it, and it is hard to say where the future will lead into this series. For a unique 2D platformer for its time to a watered-down version, this is the branching paths of Yoshi's Island. Hey, thank you all for watching. A couple of shoutouts before I end this off. One is a huge thank you to my pal and fellow YouTuber Prime Hylian for making the logo for this new series. He did an amazing job. Please, you should definitely check him out on his YouTube channel and hit him up for commissions when he's open. Also, huge shoutouts to my pal Sam who helped me come up with this show's name. Seriously, it was a lot harder than you'd think. Show him some love too. And of course, thank you all for watching. Is there a series you'd like me to talk about? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.